Howdy, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of the Sanctified podcast. Today, I want to talk about what might be the first saint you've actually heard of that I've talked about so far, and that is Saint Teresa of Avila. Now, Saint Teresa, or Teresa Ali Fatim Correa Sanchez de Capada y Ahumada, which was her name at birth, was born in, you could probably guess it, Avila, Spain. She was born March 28th, 1515, not long after Columbus introduced the, quote, New World to Europe. Perhaps he had the assistance of St. Brendan the Navigator. I don't know. And within a couple of years of St. Teresa's birth, Luther started the Protestant Reformation. So you can see that it was a pretty eventful point of time in history when she was born. It is said that Teresa's father was extraordinarily strict and pious, and Teresa didn't quite see eye to eye to him within her youth, though she still respected him. Her mother was fond of romance books, but her father felt they were not appropriate to read those types of books. Unfortunately, Teresa's mother passed away when she was only in her young 30s. The mother, not Teresa. Teresa was constantly afraid of messing up and somehow convinced her brother, when she was only 7, that they needed to go to the Moors and beg them to behead them being Teresa and her brother. Possibly she wanted to become a martyr through doing this, but we kind of know that's not like the right sentiment to go in. You don't go somewhere, ask to be killed, and become a martyr. You become a martyr through your faith and being killed through your faith and persistency in that. However, an uncle saw them before they really could get far and put a stop to their ill-intentioned journey, if you will. Teresa lived in what I would say would be a fairly normal life for a young girl at that time, but she always felt like she was a terrible sinner. When she was 16, her father sent her to an Augustinian convent to sort of like reel back in her sinful ways. At first, Teresa didn't care for life at the convent, but as her love for God grew, she became more and more content at the convent. And it also helps that it was apparently a less strict life at the convent than it was at home with her father, which is kind of ironic. When Teresa was old enough, she got to the point where she had to decide between devoting her life to her faith or finding a husband. She ultimately decided to follow her faith, which we probably could have guessed knowing that she's a saint. But this was kind of a surprise because she is said to have been very beautiful and very social and outgoing. She supposedly believed that life was the only safe life for someone as prone to sin as she was. So she decided to move to a Carmelite convent at the Incarnation in Avila, despite her father's wishes. However, life at this Carmelite convent wasn't quite what she was expecting, or how safe she was hoping to be from sin. Instead of gaining respect through piety and devotion, wealth and connections reigned supreme in the convent. There were men visiting the convent regularly and interacting with the women. The women wore jewelry and showed little in the way of modesty. And it didn't help that Teresa liked attention. And it was naturally easy for her to get that attention since she was, again, supposedly very attractive and outgoing. But her actions weren't sins in themselves, but they still kept her from being close to God. So she felt sinful nonetheless, which again is the whole reason she went to this convent. She wanted to avoid sin, not feel like she was sinning even more. Because of this, Teresa engaged in mental prayer, and she's actually highly regarded in that practice. And she has books to help guide those interested in pursuing mental prayer themselves. But despite her best efforts to practice this mental prayer and keep the Lord with her in thought and life as much as possible, she did drift away from this. She would get visitors to teach them her way of mental prayer, but that was because others in the convent wanted the gifts these visitors would bring, not so much because they wanted to help the people that were visiting. They just cared about the material items that they would get. This lasted for 18 years before Teresa's life changed significantly. So what happened to change her life? Well, it all started when she caught what we now think to be some form of malaria, and she became terribly sick. She had a seizure and was in what I guess would be called a coma afterwards. The women of the convent thought she had died because 4 days went by and she didn't wake up. So they dug her a grave because they're like, oh, she's dead, let's bury her. But I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, though, because like back then, like seizures probably weren't really known. And if it was, it's like, oh, maybe she has something possessing her. Let's get rid of her body. So, I mean, I guess it's kind of a reasonable expectation. Now we know what seizures are, and so they aren't treated the same. But anyways, Teresa did wake up, and she was still paralyzed in some capacity for 3 years afterwards. And because of that, her devotion dwindled, and she allowed this sickness to come between her and her faith. But she would overcome her challenges, and she said that prayer is an act of love. Words are not needed. Even if sickness distracts from thoughts, all that is needed is the will to love, which is pretty deep. And eventually she came to live by these words, and we'll go on and see just exactly how she did that. Eventually, a priest convinced her to return to prayer, and she was 41 at this time, and she found it difficult to return to praying. In fact, I want to share this quote with you from her. And it was, "I was more anxious for the hour of prayer to be over than I was to remain there." Now, I understand that there may be some of you listening to this that are more interested in her story than faith, but many of you likely want to deepen your faith as well. That's why you're listening to this, because you're curious. And I feel that this sentence alone is extremely encouraging, that it's okay to be nervous when you are getting into prayer. Eventually you'll become more comfortable with it, and your faith will be that much more improved, and you'll be just in a better position mentally, faithfully, however you want to look at it. Now, sorry, I do try to avoid being preachy, but that line just kind of really struck me, and I wanted to share my thoughts on it. So let me get back to Teresa now. So she did continue to struggle for praying for a while from this point on, but she never gave up. As time went on, Teresa continued to pray in her way, and her faith did grow tremendously. She felt interactions with God in various ways through this prayer, and she even levitated a few times, which is one of her miracles, but we'll get more into that later. She did once anticipate one of these levitations coming on, so she asked other nuns to sit on her to hold her down, which is kind of funny. After this, though, she pleaded that he not grant her any more favors in public, which is what she called the levitating, because she was terribly embarrassed by it, which I feel like is kind of weird, because it's supposed to be like a gift, but I guess you could also be very uncomfortable when you don't think you're worthy. So yeah, it's to each their own. And I'll just leave it at that. Teresa was very close with her friends, but she said she got a message from God that told her she was going to communicate with angels now instead, and that she should distance herself from her friends. Now, this might sound kind of weird, because you would think somebody who was so well versed in prayer and able to profess her faith much better than many others could dream to, you'd think you would want them to stay in touch with other people to spread the faith. But he works in mysterious ways, and he has his own reasons. So it's an interesting thing to think about, to say the least. But of course, her friends, being humans, they did feel betrayed, and they became convinced that she wasn't talking to God, but instead she was talking to evil spirits. They even brought a Jesuit, a member of the Society of Jesus, in to prove this to her. However, he confirmed that she was talking to God, and so that plan kind of backfired on her friends, which is kind of funny. They did convince a confessor, though, to tell her that the visions were from a devil, and not like they asked him to, and he listened to their request, but it was just like such a strong rumor that he believed it too, and they convinced him that he needed to say something to her. Now, this next part does have some conflicting reports on it. One source says the confessor told her to gesture the cross while she prayed, and another one said that she was to gesture the fig. Like, the fig is like making a fist, but you put your thumb between your index and middle finger, and it was kind of considered a obscene gesture at the time. And I tend to lean towards believing the latter, the fig, because it seems fairly odd to tell her to like gesture the sign of the cross, because presumably she would already be doing that. And she listened to the confessor to make these gestures, whichever one it was, just because he told her to do it. The Lord did talk to her again and told her that she was right to do this gesture because the confessor told her to do it. And he didn't mind that it was an offensive gesture. He understood that she was instructed to do it in good faith. And, well, she believed good faith. The other person, maybe not. But that's kind of open to interpretation. And after a while of living this fairly rough life of everybody kind of being jealous or thinking that she's like almost scamming them in a way, she did resolve to create a new convent that was focused on the more traditional values like devotion to prayer and much more simple and modest living. And well, that didn't go too well. The nuns that she knew denounced her after she began plans for this convent, St. Joseph's, and the town that they all lived in began a legal proceeding against her, but she didn't let this have any impact on her devotion. She was confident in God's protection, and she continued to work towards her goal. She founded St. Joseph's, and then she spent a lot of time writing about her life up to that point. She said she was ordered to write this book, and she included phrases to belittle herself and somewhat diminish what she said, phrases that could be like along the lines of, but what do I know? I'm just a wretched woman. And because of this, she was cleared of her legal challenges, because I guess the people pushing the legal proceedings were like, well, she learned her lesson. She knows that she's kind of below other people, so we can move past this now. So her plan kind of worked. When Teresa was 51, she felt called to journey out and spread her beliefs on prayer. She faced harsh conditions to establish more convents, but the harshest was the disdain others in the church felt towards her. She was voted to be the prioress of her former convent, but the leader of the Carmelite order excommunicated those nuns to keep Teresa away. And this type of treatment was just far too common for Teresa. And we could probably spend hours talking about everything that she endured, but just think along the lines of that and you kind of get the picture. Teresa embraced all of those hardships with a smile and believed that they weren't bad at all, actually. It's like the saying, there's no such thing as bad publicity now, because it's only served to spread the word about her and help people learn what she was trying to accomplish, and demonstrated how deep her faith was. Like, just kind of think about it. She was constantly challenged in her life, beaten down, just, pushed to the limit for a lot of people. But her devotion and faith and her connection with God was so strong that she overcame everything. Like, even if you don't believe in God, that commitment and strength of will is pretty tremendous. Like, how many people could you think of that could be turned away from what is supposed to be a safe space? Like a convent you don't really think of as, I'm faithful, and then you go to join that and everybody else is like, no, you're too faithful, we don't want you here. Like, it's kind of weird. But like, you're going somewhere, you're getting persecuted because you believe in something more than somebody else, basically, that's already there. And so they betrayed you. It's a hard life. So it's pretty impressive that she was able to do all that. In 1567, John Baptist Rossi, the Carmelite prior general from Rome, went to Avila and had Teresa establish and reform more convents. Through this, Teresa met Juan de Yepes, who became St. John of the Cross, who held the authority and respect to help her expand this reform for men too. He also was one of the few willing to help her, as we learned that many did not support her at all. So this led to the opening of the first monastery of the primitive rule in Durango, Spain. And that was kind of the rest of Teresa's life. She would help form convents or monasteries to help people find faith, deepen their faith, whatever they were trying to accomplish. And throughout this time, she was a part of multiple miracles. She performed miracles. She experienced them. We've talked about a couple. I want to just go a little more into that. So many of these miracles were in private, so she was the only one to witness them, basically. And these were visions of heaven, agonizing experiences of hell, conversations with angels, and only a couple she experienced had witnesses. And we know one of them already was levitation. Now, there's one story from the levitation that I read about that I thought was pretty funny, if it's true. And that was, Teresa was in the kitchen of one of the convents, and she had another one of her levitation experiences. And some of the sisters in there making bread were just looking at each other, and another one was coming in, and they like kind of yelled at Teresa, like, stop crying while you're levitating. You're going to ruin our bread because the tears are getting into the dough. And it's just kind of funny that it like their issue is the tears getting into the dough, not that she's levitating. So it was just such a common thing that they kind of didn't give the levitation a second guess, really. I just thought it was a little bit entertaining. All right, so back to the other miracles, though. Another one that she experienced was called transverberation. And I'm not going to lie, I look up what that was. I hadn't heard of it before. And it is essentially a piercing of the heart in which your soul feels as though, well, your heart is pierced. It's not literally pierced. Your soul just feels like the heart's been pierced. It's described as an angel piercing your heart with a dart or an arrow of love, and it only happens when you're truly open and devoted to the Lord. Now, the last miracle I want to mention, and again, one that had witnesses, was that Teresa was able to bring a child back from the dead. Her nephew was crushed by a wall that fell while he was playing on it, and the child's body was brought to her, and she gestured the sign of the cross over him. She prayed for him, and not too long after, the child awoke, got up, and he was completely uninjured. He just went back to his mom that very day and went back to being a kid. Now, there is one other that I don't know if I'd call it a miracle. It could be considered sort of seeing the future, but basically she was asked to go to a noblewoman's castle because somebody in there was going to give birth, and Teresa was asked just to attend in case anything went wrong and they needed her help. And she arrived too late just because the weather wasn't ideal. The wagon she was riding in had issues. I'm not totally sure what the exact reason was, but after she arrived, she said, "The saint won't be needed after all." Now, of course, she wasn't a saint at this point. So was she predicting that she would become a saint? Was she just kind of saying this? It's not really known one way or another. It's just a fun little note. But this is also where she would ultimately die. She was already ill when she started the journey to there. And then after she got there, she was too sick to leave. And so she stayed there until she passed away on October 5th, 1582. Teresa was beatified April 24th, 1614, almost 42 years after she died. She was canonized March 12th of 1622. Her feast day is October 15th. And a fun little fact about that is that while she passed away on the 5th, and generally feast days coincide with the days the saints pass away, the Gregorian calendar had started for them like right around that time. It wasn't utilized universally. It kind of, as it spread, people would utilize it. So it's possible that the 5th that she died on was recorded as the 5th, but according to the other calendar, it was the 15th for subsequent years. So it could have been the same day, maybe not, but it's just a fun little bit of information. Teresa is the patron saint of the Spanish Catholic writers and those ridiculed for their piety, which makes sense. She's also the patron saint of those who suffer from headaches, like Saint Denis, but she wasn't beheaded. And it's not really known why she's the patron saint of those who suffer from headaches, but she is. So had to include that. She founded the Discalced Carmelites in 1970, and she was declared Doctor of the Church. And she was only one of only a couple women to have achieved that honor. Now, I encourage you to read her autobiography, The Life of Teresa of Jesus. There are various reprints of it, so the titles might differ a tiny bit, but they'll be along those lines. The book goes into more detail of this devoted woman, and unless I want to make a 30-hour podcast just talking about her, I can't cover everything here. And it is because of her writing, though, that we have so much information about that, and we're pretty fortunate to have her very own autobiography preserved to this day. And by now, you might know the rest. I encourage the civil discussion on Teresa in the comments with those around you. Feel free to add your own fun facts in the comments if you know something that I didn't cover. Give me your opinions on everything. I'm excited to learn your thoughts on Saint Teresa of Avila. Of course, as always, have a wonderful day. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you next time.